In this lecture, which is part 9, we will be combining the middleware. So we shall learn simple middleware pipeline, a welcome page middleware and static file middleware to appreciate that it defines the application behavior and combine multiple middleware. Okay, so let's switch over to Visual Studio and do some coding. Now let's delete all this code that we have written so far and we'll start afresh in the configure method. So here what we'll do is we'll introduce a welcome page middleware. So app.use welcome page. Use welcome page. All right, and I will explain to you in a bit what this welcome page is all about. Welcome page middleware. Now if you see on the IntelliSense, it adds the welcome page middleware to the pipeline, and this is an extension method as well. Okay, so let's run this application first. Now this is your welcome page. So this is if you are just routing, just navigating to the home page, it will give the welcome page. Now here is another funny thing is that this one actually doesn't require any services to be configured, and neither it requires any public constructor. So if I get rid of these configure service and the constructor as well as this iConfiguration object, it will still work. So to demonstrate that, I will again run this, Control F5 till first build, and it is doing the same, it is rendering the same welcome page. So this is a very simple middleware that doesn't require any configuration or any constructor. All it requires is to have the configure method, okay, with an IApp builder returned. Now we build the middleware pipeline is in the ASP.NET Core by calling methods on iApplication builder like this use welcome page, and these are called the extension methods again. Now using extension methods allows us to effectively add functionality to the iApp builder or iApplication builder object while keeping their implementations isolated from it. Now starting each middleware with the use improves the discoverability, and you can see all the built-in middleware in the IntelliSense. So if we actually get to the point and to see all the use extension methods, so these are the extension methods. Use middleware, use default file, use exception handler, and use router, use signaler, use static files. Okay, so there is a list on the IntelliSense available. So this is also for the easy discoverability that we are using the use. Now at one here, the request comes, HTTP request comes, and it is received by the ASP.NET Core server. It is forwarded to the ASP.NET Core server, and at 3, ASP.NET Core server receives the request and builds an HTTP context object and passes it to the middleware pipeline. Okay, and this request is handled by this welcome page middleware, which generates an HTML response and returns it back to the pipeline. And this response is passed to the ASP.NET Core web server, which returns the HTTP response containing the HTML is sent to the browser. Now, this is a very simple case in which this is the first and only middleware in the pipeline, and this welcome page middleware receives the request and must decide how to handle it. The middleware responds by generating an HTML response no matter what request it receives. So this response passes back to the ASP.NET Core web server, which forwards it onto the user to display there in their browser. That's what I explained. Now, as with all ASP.NET Core applications, you define the middleware pipeline in the configure method, which I have shown you several times. Now let's see another scenario of handling a static files. Okay, so here I've written the browser makes an HTTP request to the server, and the request is forwarded to the ASP.NET Core Web Server. Request is passed to the middleware pipeline. After receiving the HTTP request and building an HTTP context object just for revision, the request is handled by the welcome page middleware, which generates the HTML response that returns back to the pipeline. And then response passes back to the ASP.NET Core Web Server, and HTML response containing the HTML. The response containing the HTML is returned to the browser. Now let's see another case of a static file middleware. Okay, so here let's study this figure, and I will actually get to the code now. Static file middleware returns the requested file after handling the request. What we are going to do is, here, let us go back to the code. Now here, instead of app.use welcome page, I will use app.use static files. Okay, this middleware. So enable static file serving for the current request path. Okay, so we are already familiar with this, but I will show you what is happening over here. So now let's run this application. And browse to sun.jpg. So I have got this nice sun image. Now what happened if I go for a location, go for a URL which is not available? So let's say sun missing dot JPEG. Now there is nothing called sun missing. So instead it brings this localhost 404 error. The page was not found, HTTP error 404. Okay. Now let's explain that this image, this particular thing. Now here again the request comes to the static file middleware, and static file middleware returns 404 to the browser as the file does not exist at the requested path. That's why we got the 404 error. So previously, if you see, this one, a static file middleware returns the requested file after handling the request. But in this case, the local host page cannot be found because it is not there at that request path. Now let's get back to Visual Studio, and I will get rid of this use static files and put some more code which was there when the project was first configured. When the project was first created, the configure method was there with some more middleware and this configure services method. So we'll restore that. Now, by this point, I'm quite sure that you have a good grasp of the middleware pipeline insofar as it defines your application's behavior. So in this section, we'll see how to combine multiple middleware to form a pipeline. Now, using standard middleware components. Now this is performed in the configure method again. So when the application was first created, you had most of these exception handler, use static files, use routing endpoints. So when you created, so I reintroduced that. The only section is that I am not showing the developer exception page. Okay, so and I have got rid of this error that I had introduced earlier to show you what is the developer exception page. So now if you run this application, this will be running as a pipeline or of middleware components, and I will then come back to the defining it or explaining it. So it's just a welcome page. right? Because there is no error. Now, how do we explain this? Now here we have seen in the code that first is the error handler middleware. The error handling middleware is the first and also the last middleware to process the request. And this is the second middleware in the pipeline, that is the static file middleware, and it handles the static file request before they reach the endpoint middleware, that is the last. Now the routing middleware, as you have seen in the first part of this playlist, that this routing middleware looks for a razor page endpoint in the request. So it looks for a razor page in the route. And finally, when it sends the request to the endpoint middleware, which is the last in the pipeline. So if there are no razor page to handle as found out by or unable to be found out by the routing, it returns a 404 response. Okay. Now here the impact of ordering can most obviously be seen when you have two pieces of middleware that are both listening for the same path. That means what I am saying that, the welcome path middleware, which actually returns a welcome path, which is not applicable in production. It is just a sort of holding page. But if it routes to the, the same URL as the endpoint middleware, then if it is the first, if it comes before the endpoint, it returns the welcome page before it is being seen and handled by the endpoint middleware. So what I mean to say is that if I change the order, so if I introduce this app.welcome page again over here, use welcome page, okay, and route it to the front slash or the root URL, or even if I don't do it, it will still be routed to the root URL. Then you will see that this endpoint middleware will not come into picture. This will straight away return or short circuit the response from the use welcome page middleware. So seeing is believing. So let's run the application once more. So here now this application brings the familiar welcome page, and all I have changed was that I reintroduced this app.useWelcomePage middleware at the beginning. So it has actually responded to the request for a URL that it matches, okay, front slash, it is the root page, and it could never reach the use endpoint. So it was just handled, it was returned, request was handled and returned the response with the welcome page. So in this lecture, we have seen two simple cases of single pieces of middleware, the welcome page and the static files, and then we have combined those to some other middleware to form a pipeline of middleware or middleware pipeline. And we have seen the following observations, that each middleware component in a pipeline generally addresses a single function and it handles only one functionality of a request. For example, the logging middleware deals with the logging the request, static file middleware only deals with the returning the static file in the request, and this means we are not forced to having authentication or image resizing behavior in a static file middleware, for which there are additional pieces of middleware. And to build a complete application, multiple middleware are composed together that form a pipeline, and each middleware has access to the original request as well as any changes made to the request by the previous middleware. On the response cycle, each middleware can access or inspect the response and can modify the response as it passes back through the pipeline before being sent to the user. Okay, so that's it.